we're moving on to our next talk, which is the legal and regulatory evolution of NFTs, what's coming in the future and what you can do about it. I'd like to welcome Nicola, McNeely, Dan Hyde, and Leon Hurd. So please welcome our new speakers.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So very quickly, I'll start off, because all three of us are from the same firm, HCR Law. So if I could introduce the band, we've got Nicola at the far end, lead singer, head of tech. Leon, saxophonist in the middle, works closely with me, so we all work together. And then me, Dan Hyde. So perhaps just to sort of introduce myself and where we're going with this. So I'm obviously a lawyer specializing in the NFT space and emerging tech. I'm also a business coach at the University of Cambridge, again specializing in emerging tech, and professor of digital regulation at the University of London. So I kind of come at this from two angles, and basically when any entrepreneur or startup approach me, what I first try and understand is what the moving parts of their business is. And then really I'm looking for kind of three key elements. So number one is innovation. So, what's unique either about the product or the way it's delivered that's going to mean that it either beats or eliminates the competition. That innovation, does it have what we call commercial viability? So, does it actually have any business application? Does it add value? Is it going to generate an income stream and be profitable? And then thirdly and critically also is that model then compliant, legally compliant? And the reason I kind of framed it in that way with all three elements is I think what's sometimes forgotten in all of this, because let's face it, compliance doesn't really sound sexy, especially to entrepreneurs that are launching business. The last thing they want to do is meet a lawyer and spend money on legal services. But all of those three elements are, if you like, interdependent and interconnected, because you need to get your compliance right in order to actually set up the structure to see what you're going to do. So, right at the very start, if you don't start thinking through what you can do and what your compliance looks like, it's going to be very hard to move forward. The other thing I think that probably isn't always understood is kind of what NFTs are from a legal perspective. So everyone here is an NFT enthusiast, and we all think we know what NFTs are, but in the eyes of the law, it's very difficult to simply define NFTs, because they are, if you like, chameleonic. They are essentially computers. Like computers, they have myriad use cases across a number of different industries. I mean, as we've seen from this event, we've got sport NFTs, gaming NFTs, art, and much, much more. So they're very hard to pin down because they have this versatility. And that versatility is, if you like, a commercial strength because of the potential applications. But from a compliance perspective, it can also be a disadvantage. And what you need to do when you're putting your venture, your project together, is ask yourself, okay, in the context of what I'm doing, what role does the NFT have, and what is it supporting? So, by way of example, if the NFT in your business is basically acting like a financial instrument, so it looks or acts like a share or a future or an option, or as we keep hearing, a security, or for example it's supporting what seems to be an investment scheme, then the chances are it's going to come up against regulation, and you're going to be looking to see whether you need permissions from a regulator. If, for example, the NFT is, let's say your scheme gives some sort of reward, and the reward that you're giving involves an element of luck or chance. So the next thing you ask yourself is, okay, am I creating some kind of gambling scheme here? Am I going to come up against regulation from gambling? I mean, by way of example, I've had entrepreneurs dealing with me, and they couldn't see any problem with what they were doing, but it turned out that they were rolling out a project that would touch upon, say, Dubai, and although it wasn't obvious to them, there were gambling elements, which of course in Dubai are basically criminal. So you can be shut down, you can be prosecuted, you can actually be arrested and thrown in prison. So you've got to look at all of that and say, okay, look at the context. What is my NFT doing within context? And the other thing that you need to understand when looking at your NFT is, can it deliver on, if you like, let's call it the customer promise. So, for example, if your NFT is being used to transfer or, let's say, sell a virtual asset, can it actually do that? If you're selling a hotel in the metaverse with an NFT, that NFT isn't the same as the hotel. The hotel is something separate. Let's say the platform that it's on, you're alleged down the line of, I don't know, breaching some sort of user agreement or behaving in a way that means you can be evicted. Then what would likely happen in that situation is you wouldn't be able to have access to that metaverse anymore. Your digital asset, the hotel, could basically be extinguished, deleted. So you'd be left holding an on-chain NFT, which sure was immutable proof to the world that you had acquired that virtual asset, but unlike a bricks and mortar hotel, that hotel doesn't exist. So again, that's one example, but you look and say, okay, what I'm promising here, the expectations that I'm creating in my customer, can I actually deliver that through my NFT? Because NFTs, like chameleons, they can change, but like a chameleon, it's still a chameleon, it's still an NFT. It hasn't changed into the virtual asset that, in this case, it's representing or tethered to. And one final point before I pass over is stand back and have a think, if you like, map at the outset all the different countries, all the different jurisdictions that you are going to be targeting with your venture. Because it amazes me that so many entrepreneurs think, well, I live in London, or my venture is going to be incorporated in the US or whatever it may be, and they think that that's the end of the game. It isn't, because you have to look at all the different countries that you may be targeting or engaging with customers and say, okay, what's the position there? When I rub up against that legislation, how are those countries going to treat me? So again, back to the example about Dubai. If you're rolling it out and it's going to have customers in Dubai, do you need to tweak that? Is there some element that just doesn't fly in that jurisdiction because of their particular laws? So you have to literally scope not only what the business is in the context, but also, where it's going to be happening and which customers you're going to be dealing with. I'm now going to pass you to Leon, who hopefully is going to take you through how this space is developing and what you might do in order to basically stay off the radar of the regulator.
Thanks, Dan. No, that's great. I got my own mic there. Okay. And thank you, everybody, for coming and bearing with us during the lunchtime shift. I know it's not the easy one to do, and hopefully you'll all get a chance to get some food shortly. I think my opening remark, actually, is I feel quite vindicated being here today, vindicated in my decision to pivot into emerging tech some 3 years ago. And I remember it quite well, because at the time, I was a financial crime prosecutor working offshore. And I was tasked to start looking at crypto assets and distributed ledger technology, but in the context of criminal typologies and understanding how they might work and how they might be used by criminals. But I was entirely fascinated by it all, and little did I know that I was developing some quite transferable skills to bring back into the tech area, which is either deeply concerning or very interesting, whichever your position is. But I was fortunate enough to get a role when I returned back to London a couple of years ago, working alongside Dan and Nicola, and I get to spend my time working with businesses and helping them to navigate the legal and regulatory frameworks around NFTs, blockchain, DeFi, and all the wonderful bits in between. And so I work, a large part of what I do is helping businesses develop compliant structures and develop governance regimes and protocols and policies that give them the best chance to mitigate against potential future risks. And so it's a challenging role, but it's one that it has enabled us to really think about the regulatory piece. And many times clients will come to me and say, well, why is the regulatory bit so interesting? And or why is it so important? Or why do I need to think about it at all? And I think I'm going to try and share with you how I present it to them. I very much see the NFT industry and the developing regulatory framework as sort of coming towards each other and clashing in a Venn diagram type manner. And that space, that intersection where the two things meet, I think is really important to understand. I think any founder of an NFT business, they need to think and understand exactly what that space looks like for the purposes of their business. Because from my perspective, if you develop an NFT business that sits comfortably in that space between regulation and the growth of the NFT sector, you're onto a winner, hopefully. And actually, what one tends to find is those people that set themselves up to put in place structures in their business fare well. And the point was sort of driven home at a talk I went to a couple of weeks ago. I'm stealing a person's line here, so unfortunately I can't remember his name to give credit, but he said, nothing kills companies quicker than non-compliance. And I think it's such a poignant phrase, and it's very true of the NFT business industry as well. And actually what makes it difficult in emerging tech and for NFTs, more so than your sort of traditional businesses, is the fact that the question of what is and what is not compliant is completely unsettled. It's a completely developing area. And that's compounded also by the fact that NFTs are capable of being used for multiple purposes. And as Dan said, they're chameleonic. They can be one or more things at the same time. And that's just, quite frankly, is very difficult for any regulator to grapple with. So that's kind of how I set it up. You've got this interesting, area that's very difficult to regulate, and where regulation is increasingly coming to the forefront. And I think we're at an inflection point in the NFT market right now. We've reached a position where the mass appeal and the utility of them means that there has to be a focus on the credibility of the industry. And I think that's what we're seeing governments, regulators, and law enforcement agencies around the world doing. They understand that there is huge potential for these to cause harm. So they want to step in wherever they can. So I guess it comes back to the question in the title of the presentation, what can you do about it? Well, I think there are three things that every NFT business needs to be doing. Firstly, they need to be thinking about what are the horror stories that the regulators and law enforcement agencies are thinking about. And the reason they need to do that is to make sure whatever business they develop is as far away from that as possible. The second thing they need to do is keep in mind what are those regulatory headwinds that are coming. What are the developments and the changes coming through? And again, it's about being ahead of the problem and implementing policies or governance structures in your business that can deal with those upcoming risks. And the third one is sort of a pervasive one. It's one that you could probably do at number one, really. It's engage in the process. We're all active members of this community, and it's important that we all contribute to the development of the regulatory regime. So going through them, number one, what are those horror stories? Well, look, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list. I think the headline ones that I think about are, Tornado Cash being used as a mixer platform, effectively, an autonomous, got my words out there, autonomous piece of code that was used to launder funds and, in particular, to make payments to sanctioned entities. We've seen OFAC intervene and sanction them. We've also got things like the Frosties rug pull, huge amounts of money lost by members of the public, and that sort of perception, if you will, of NFT launches being pump and dump scams. And then you've also got things like the phishing scams, and I think a number of people have touched upon it today. And the big one recently is Bored Ape, and the idea that Instagrams and Discords can get hacked and can lead to quite significant loss. And I think the common theme that I think strikes a real chord of fear in regulators and law enforcement agencies is the fact that you have huge potential for members of the public, sometimes vulnerable members of the public, to lose substantial sums, substantial amounts of money. But also there's this kind of perception that it's, there's this money laundering risk, this idea that fiat is being laundered into crypto and then back into fiat again. And so bringing it back to when you're thinking about your NFT businesses, you've got to think about your KYC, your policies and procedures, your CDD. What are you doing to address these risks? So going to my second point, what are those regulatory headwinds? Well, again, there's loads of regulation all over the world, but the things that I think are really interesting, you've got the MiCA regulation, that's the market in crypto assets, and that's going to bring in a wholesale change in the way in which crypto assets are dealt with. You've got the whole piece around, being authorized to actually issue them to the public. But the big point for me that comes out of MiCA is sort of these onerous disclosure obligations that are going to come to life in terms of the white papers, which I think for all intents and purposes might end up being like prospectuses. And you know, there's a big question about how much NFTs are going to be caught by it. I know it's kind of it's been mooted whether or not it extends to NFTs, but I think it's fair to say, and again going back to the chameleonic point, when NFTs behave or act like securities or designated investments, I think it's almost for sure that they're going to be caught within the regulation. The other thing I think is a big headwind to bear in mind is sort of the FATF, so the Financial Task Force, the international standard setter. Their recommendation 16 in their paper of 2018, in which they talk about the travel rule, and it's this idea that virtual asset service providers need to exchange originator and beneficiary or recipient information, details of the person and account numbers whenever there's a transfer of virtual assets. Again, I think this is a big thing to keep in mind, because one of the big aspects of blockchain has always been the pseudonymity, the fact that everything sits behind a number or a lengthy code. This idea of having detail of people sitting, somewhere in the ether. It does mean that there has to be, a wholesale shift in the way that you collect information, the way that you onboard clients, and the way that you collect data, because you will have law enforcement agencies that are investigating things, asking you for these things, and it's going to be important that you can demonstrate that you either have it, or if you don't, why? What risk-based procedure did you have in place that meant you didn't need to have it? And I think the third one, it's something that's new in terms of regulatory headwind, but it's this idea of embedded supervision. And there's quite a bit of talk at the EE level about sort of investing in a project to look at what technological advancements could be made to embed automatic supervision on the blockchain. And again, this could have a transformative effect, really, because if you've got sort of this automatic supervision going on, then it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that our NFT businesses are compliant for fear of being caught, if you will. So I think that brings me to sort of the third point, and my final point is, well, how do we engage in the process? Because I think, as with anything, when it's developing, what do we want to do? We want to create a marketplace that's efficient, that's effective, that's safe for the participants. But we also want to, we might think to ourselves, we also want to create projects that are investable. And I think most VCs will treat minimum viable projects that are sort of regulatorily robust. They'll see them as much more attractive for investment than others. So, stepping aside from that, what I think we all need to do is lobby, is to consult, is to feed in, so that we are at a moment where we're developing the regulatory regime, but we've got to ensure that it's developed in a way that doesn't stifle innovation, and one that sort of represents the diverse range of NFT businesses that we all come into love. On that note, I'll hand you over to Nicola.
Thank you very much, Leon. So that's interesting, talking about lobbying and what people can do in the community. So the only thing that I would say from that perspective is I think the NFT community has an obligation to self-regulate. And I think there's a lot of stuff that happens in the community that is just not tolerable, and that we should stop and we should call it out. I'm an NFT investor. I've been involved in blockchain since 2013. I actually went to work for the Royal Mint, which is part of the British government, owned by HM Treasury, and we created basically the world's first gold-backed digital currency. So I got involved in blockchain really early, before Ethereum even existed, and CryptoKitties were a thing, but that was it pretty much. There was not much else in the NFT space at the time. So I look at it very much from the perspective of what's the technology, how does the technology work, what does it do, and how does it actually work and operate. Now, a lot of the projects that I work with now are in Web3, in the NFT space, and as Dan said, they are chameleonic, and that's really, really important, because clients will often come to me with a project and will say, oh, the space is moving really quickly. There's a new trend around moving from creative rights to utility. So we want to give all the utility to the community. We want to take all the utility away, or we want to go CCO. Like Xcopy went CCO, that's the way to do it. Put the hands back and power into the community. But in saying that, you're doing something fairly significant, because you're taking all the rights away from the creators and the artists and putting them into the hands of the owner or the investor. And you're completely changing what you've created. When Moonbirds pivoted in the middle of that project to become CCO, how did they have the right to do that? Because people had already invested and bought those NFTs. So what right did they have to change the ownership of the copyright and the intellectual property midway through a project. Now, if I was an investor in that project, I'd be very unhappy because I'd invested in something here and I ended up getting something entirely different. So what I would say is think very carefully about your roadmap, share it with your advisors, make sure you get consistent advice across the whole piece. One of the biggest issues that we see is people get some advice, but not enough. So they might not look at the legal, the accounting, and the banking, and the tax position, and the regulatory position holistically. You need to look at it all, because if you make a mistake in the structuring, you won't be able to bank the proceeds. So you need to think about it from the wider piece. So quite often people will come to us with an offshore structure. They've been advised it's great for tax, investors will invest in it, but what they're doing actually ends up being an illegal lottery in Cayman Islands or in Dubai or something like that. So they haven't necessarily thought through the legal angles, or they haven't necessarily thought through the business angles of how they're going to bank the income. So get advice from a team of people that can cover all of those aspects for you: legal, regulatory, tax, banking. You need all of that. So one of the things that I discovered very early in this space was, unless you've got the end-to-end contacts to make these projects work, you'll fall down somewhere, you'll hit a tripwire. So it's really important to pull out to your contacts in the market, say, do you know someone who can help me on this discrete issue? Because before we commit to setting up a structure offshore or whatever it may be, we just need to make sure this isn't going to cause us a problem and be a tripwire down the line. So yeah, I would just say, be really careful in terms of your structuring, get holistic advice, and self-regulate. So do things in your company that you think are fair to the community and also fair to your employees. So, for example, think about if you're going to allow your employees and your staff to purchase your NFTs or to participate in the NFT projects you're launching. What's fair? So what's fair to the community, and regulate it on that basis. I was just going to bring it back around really to Dan and Leon and say, you know, there is a big move into utility at the moment. So whether that's staking or voting rights with doodles, ApeCoin, etc. The SEC are investigating Yuga Labs, as you know, in terms of Bored Ape Yacht Club. So how far can the sands shift from being a project that falls outside the regulatory space to all of a sudden flooding into regulation, whether you introduce one aspect like staking or an aspect like a coin or a utility coin?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that quickly. So I think that's a great point, Nicola, because you're back to basically planning from the start. And that's why I said, you know, you look at your venture and you say, okay, it's going to fly, it's, you know, it's innovative, it's commercially viable, but it's compliant. But it might be compliant at, you know, point A, but then as you say, it's got to be compliant at point B, point C, point D. And you're absolutely right. And I think the problem often is in the minds of founders, they maybe don't think about what they might do down the track. They just think about what they're going to do at the point of launch. And that's really important. And another point I'd add to it, because I think people, you may sit there and think, well, yeah, but, you know, why would it be problematic for me? Why would I kind of need to get it right? Would I ever actually be on the regulator's radar? But what happens in practice is, for example, is you may need to, let's say, partner with, whether it's a bank, a credit card provider, a payment services provider, and they say to you, actually, we're a bit worried about this little bit. Can you get us some sort of legal opinion, or can you prove to us that you are compliant? Otherwise, we can't take this any further. And then that's the point where all these things, where it then gets stopped in its tracks, because it's like, hang on a minute. We thought we'd just get this under the wire without anybody seeing it. So all of a sudden, it's not just maybe a lawyer telling you that it's problematic. There's a real world problem. I mean, did you want to add to that, Liam?
No, I think you've caught the point well. I think, for me, front load the regulatory piece. That's my number one advice. Don't put the cart before the horse. Front load the regulatory piece and do so at every stage of your project. And you'll find that's the best way to sort of navigate through quite complex rules and regulations, really.
Thank you. And just really quickly, if you are going to change and pivot, so if the market conditions change, you need to change your project for whatever reason, for God's sake, go back to your advisors and talk about it, because you may actually be jumping down a mine trap So be really, really careful, because yes, market conditions change, but don't do it blindly. Just because you took advice a few months ago about what you were doing, if you change your roadmap, speak to your advisors. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.